You also have environment. So, in some cultures, like when I was in Thailand and crying about this, because it was more pain by a 500% margin than I'd ever experienced in my life. When I was crying about this in Thailand, people were kind to me. But when I didn't trust myself to cry in the US, because I've been judged so much for tears that I've cut them off, which is unhealthy, but rewarded. It's rewarded unhealthiness. So in order to have some sense of self-esteem, I've cut that part of my psyche off to adapt to an abuse cult that doesn't want to deal with these things. Now, when I would mention that I was sexually abused by a therapist in the United States, without a beat, 90% of Americans went on to the next subject as if I had said nothing. Now, this is profound ignorance, but it's also shame dumping, because it's saying the most significant experience of your adult life, I don't care. I'm interested in talking about Reeboks or the Cubs score. Sure, you've been raped by your therapist and had to pay for it and were disoriented, but did you see the score? This is sociopathic in the extreme. A fictitious game with people we don't even know, with numbers representing a score more important than a human heart. Sociopathic, protocol in action. And then there's the suppression aspect. Some people would avoid me and go away from it, or even shame and attack me for revealing a taboo. And this whole wound was so deep that, how do you respond to the fact that you make everyone uncomfortable? I need love and belonging desperately because I have no girlfriend and my therapist has just disowned me because I broke the unwritten law of criticizing him for being an asshole. Someone's an asshole, and you're paying them a lot of money to be an asshole, criticize them for being an asshole. But if they're a narcissistic asshole, they don't say, oh, I'm so sorry, how can I fix it and get you better treatment? Instead, they go into defense and how dare you and blah, blah, blah. My narcissistic asshole hasn't offered a refund for pathological sexual abuse. That there's a 10-hour recording. Plus layer upon, and he finally apologized. But you see, you're not valuable enough to be worth giving the money back to. I'm more important. My need to escalate a romantic relationship, my need to give you a drug overdose, my need to blame it all on you, and my need to have the money, it's all more important than you. And that's what love is. You see, and when your parents say that's what love is, and then your therapist says that's what love is, it fucks up the definition of love, which isn't hard to do because we have no definition. You and I are not given a definition of what love is, so you're more vulnerable to being, driven crazy in that dynamic. Now, the value hierarchy also plays in. Belief plays in. Am I a valuable person? Apparently not in this, really painful area of feminine self. Is my life valuable? No. See, I got suicidal after my therapist shamed me on top of the other whole dynamics. And I communicated this. But this wasn't popular. So it's kind of like, what should we do? Should we help Dane out? Or should we just let him die? It's much easier to just let him die and say, he needs to deal with it. He needs to grow up, was the message that they gave to me when I called his peers. The Human Awareness Institute didn't want to deal with the fact that one of their facilitators that they'd trained and referred to me had broken every therapeutic guideline in the book, which of course they don't tell you what the guidelines are in the book. They're the therapist, you expect them to know. Nor do you have critical discernment when you're on an overdose. So even if you did know, that's all out the window. Peter announced that he lied to his wife halfway through the session, that she didn't even know this was a psychedelic session. That didn't even sound like a red flag high. It sounded like, oh, that's how therapists get things done. They lie to their wives. Relationship therapists lie to their wives. Normal. Feels completely fine under the influence of MDMA. So the value hierarchy ties in because, like, I learned very on, because I was so isolated growing up, that good relationships were the most important thing. So they're the most important thing. So if like some people in our cult get brainwashed into thinking that money is the most important thing. The Forbes 400 list, that's the pinnacle. If you can just get on that list and have more billions, preferably than anyone else, then you've really arrived. A materialistic chauvinist, this will make perfect sense. Bits of paper more important than human beings. Well, I had enough of that, and I knew money wasn't the answer, because the richer I got, the more, it didn't help. So I knew money wasn't the answer. But when I was in a good, loving relationship, I never felt so good as I felt in my entire life. So the number one thing for me was a loving relationship. So the fact that it's so important, why did they commit suicide in 1929? Well, we brainwashed men to know that their value is related to their fund, their economic state or rank. And so if suddenly you knock out 90% of someone's economic value, or all of it, they feel as if they have zero value, because their whole value was brainwashed by a materialistic cult to being around money. So they jump out of buildings rather than face a day with no value. Well, when you value being treated well in good relationships as your highest thing, and the person you paid the most money to and took the most risk to and trusted knocks the rug out from under you, you feel like absolute shit. And so it's devastating. It's as I say, 500% more pain than I ever experienced in my adult life, simultaneously not being able to work to medicate the pain. Because you should go and see 5 new therapists to fix the abuse of the old therapist. Well, that's going to take a lot of money at the very time you can't work. That's why you need therapy. And so there's these tensions and things along those lines. And then there's the denial, meaning my therapist, Peter Sandhill, needed to feel great about it. So every time I would hint that he was being quite abusive, he withdrew, just like our, abusive father withdraws or punishes the child. So Peter withdrew all love and affection if I in any way hinted that he'd done anything wrong. But he was my sole contact for love and belonging, which was really a tailspin of abuse, and it all blew up in my face. And then I was told by my community, the high organization, that they didn't want my truth present in the room of love. And that's kind of the stereotype, typical, as bad as it gets in, fucked up, uneducated, new agey, sex-craved groups that don't bother doing psychological studies, don't analyze the data, don't teach the students, anything, and then blame the child, blame the student, blame the minority, blame the scapegoat, one way or another. It's not the people in the power structure. And so there's a ton of me invested in a tailspin equation that ends very badly. Meaning if you take 100 sensitive men in emotional pain to begin with, to deal with trauma and go through this protocol, some of them are going to kill themselves. Some of them are going to go insane. Some of them are going to hate themselves for the rest of their life and become addicted. And some of them are going to go and kill their perpetrator. There's a lot of things that American men in this state are going to do because we don't teach anyone how to deal with these states. We don't even teach our therapists how to deal with these states. The level of incompetence that I encountered in the professional community around the rage I felt at this was so high, it became dangerous to reach out to yet another therapist and discover, the incredible amazement and anger at their stupidity. Like, you haven't read a book on trauma? You don't, I mean, my goodness, I am, the last thing I need is to pay another therapist to abuse me and make the last therapist's abuse work and worse after the last therapist made the parental abuse worse and, laid me flat on my back with a hefty bill. So this is all in the equation. That equation doesn't get better. The part of the psyche or the part of the financial investment in the damaging and destructive equation is governed by the equation. And here you have the law of mass and intelligence and empathy. Like, I would plead with my group of therapists to change the balance of power into a healthier dynamic. They wanted me to keep it all secret so that I would have no support. I wanted everyone to know for there to be public safety. But with their protocol of withdrawing or getting angry if I did what was good for me, and me clinging to still the hope that I was being loved or helped, this was, so there's further, abuses of power. That's how trauma became PTSD. And so, in this dynamic, if you can move towards a symmetrical relationship where you pay money to be helped rather than pay money to be abused and be exploited, you have a more circular, healthier, sustainable, a graceful pattern of interacting. When you pay money and give trust and spend innocence and take time and put your body on the line to be severely abused, at the convenience of the abuser, you have a tremendously asymmetrical relationship. It's completely unsustainable, very toxic. And you have a very violent thing. It's like taking a wheel. See, when you have a balanced exchange, it's a circular wheel. When you compress that, so all the benefit goes to the abuser and all the cost goes to, in this case, the client. Now you've got an incredibly painful ride if you can imagine trying to drive 60 miles down the highway with pancakes-typed wheels, not pancakes that were round this way. I'm talking flat or stick-like wheels, where the wheel has been correct. The amount of shock and violence you go through when you're in an equation that is incredibly toxic for you and you can't get out of it, you're in a tailspin, is intense. And so I was in such an equation. It leads to violence. And in a New Age community, when you start to get raging and angry and bitter, they have all the New Age judgments ready to say, well, don't be angry at us. That's not New Agey, etc. To calm down, tell us how wonderful we are, etc. Be positive. Look at the bright side, as you're spiraling down, at 500 miles an hour towards your death. Look at the bright side. And I nearly died several times because explosive emotions that aren't regulated in an insane environment make it very unsafe to drive, as just one example. So you have a lot of me in this system, and you have me still identifying and still trusting that surely these people who love me and care me are going to be there for me. So as they consistently betrayed that trust, there's a deeper and deeper depression and bitterness because I still don't know what I'm doing. I still don't know what trauma was. And as I say, it was a stranger in a cafe that recommended a book. Hooray for strangers in cafes, boo for sociopathic therapists. And so how am I going to pull out of this tailspin? Because you also need to integrate a psychedelic session before you can move beyond it. I was regressed, traumatized, split, and insane at the kind of influence of my therapists. You can't leave and just move on until you put yourself back together again. But the part of me that was in there was in so much pain. How do I put something together when I'm in so much pain? It's like trying, if you kind of imagine a furnace at 4,000 degrees, and someone puts a bomb in it, And if you don't get in there and fix the furnace, the house is going to burn down. But every second you're anywhere near a 4,000 degree furnace, you feel like you're dying. That's the situation I felt myself in. I felt I would go crazy and die if I didn't figure out what was going on. But every time I would look at the level of pain, it would wipe me out so much that I would become a food addict. And so this was a very, very difficult tailspin to pull out of. So obviously, mistakes on my part in I didn't know what I didn't know. Who does in our cult? But anyway, I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know how to screen a therapist better than charm and warmth. My therapist was very charming. Said he loved me, and that sounded good, you know. But the key is to come back to the witness. So some part of me is reliving all this trauma in order to talk about it. And some part of me is living with you, the audience, and watching this part of me go through it. So pulling energy out of the equation as opposed to continually reinvesting. As fast as I could get sane. So this meant studying a lot of psychological books and things. Studying things like post-traumatic growth and what were the variables. And so the thing to be going back to that comment about there are no closed systems, meaning this system had money going into it, it had time going into it, it had vulnerability going into it, it had incredible openness and innocence going into it. That was all the energy going into it, and then my therapist's time and energy and stuff going into it. But it also has energy getting out with time, with time passing. As I learn more and more, studying more and more therapeutic trauma books, I first of all understand this is an epidemic. I haven't been singled out because I'm a bad person, and that's why I've been left to die by my therapist who doesn't want to deal with it. No. This is rampant cultural stupidity that we just leave, often our women, but, it feels just as rotten to abuse a woman and not know what went on as it does to be abused, not know what's going on, and we don't teach emotional or relational or sexual competency. So we don't get it. If we treated airline pilots the way that we treat relationships, 99% of all relationships crash and burn for reasons other than death. And if we just loaded mindless idiots into 747s and told them to take off and fly us to Tokyo, 99% of our planes would crash and burn, not because the person had a heart attack by flying, but because they had no idea what they're doing. And this, again, just speaks to the fact that we're a cult, that when money is involved, we take great care. So the airlines will get sued, and the planes cost millions of dollars, so we train our pilots for 6 years. Our human hearts are free, they're feminine, so we treat them like shit. But the human heart and an intimate, healthy relationship is more sophisticated. And the technology needed to do it gracefully and well 99% of the time is more sophisticated than flying a plane, because planes don't have feelings. Planes don't have hormones. We do. So the sophistication of the modulation and communication technology has to be higher. Planes don't argue with you when you're about to land. I don't feel like landing. You land, you go. No, planes do what they're told at critical moments. People don't. You may be at a key touchdown point, at a vital point in one of your lives, and they decide to have a fit at an awkward moment, and you crash and burn. Now, developing a larger identity and vision outside of the equation is part of it. So one of the things that I've cultivated is a teaching identity. That's who's giving this video. So I decided I can't get out of the equation. I don't even know if I'm going to live. But I can teach the mathematics of the equation that I'm in so that other people learn from it. So now you have purpose. You can endure any what if you have a why. Well, my why is one less sexual traumatic abuse survivor, one less narcissistic, fucked up therapist. That's my why. And, 1,000 hours of video is worth that why. Because I know going through this is worse than death. It's quick and relatively painless to commit suicide. So that was my why to hang in there, to explore the journey and put it out there. So I developed an identity that's outside the wound, the one that is teaching about the wound. And also, since nobody advocated for me, I developed an identity as an advocate. So I'm helping several people going through similar abuse, not in the exact same way, but the pattern is the same. The big one abuses the small one and then brushes it under the carpet and walks away and then blames and attacks the person for telling the truth. That's kind of the essence of the American shame abuse wound. And that's happening all over the place, right and left at every level. So, identifying with parts outside the wound and, getting married was part of that. I chose my wife on the metric that I could do more to help her well-being than anyone that I could think of. Meaning I could not think of a single other person, and in looking at her life, there was no one else who could be as supportive for her as me, based on that analysis. So the fact that I could make the biggest contribution in her life, I also did the analysis, if I spent 1,000 hours with her or 1,000 hours with this woman or with this person, whose life would I benefit the most? And I decided and concluded from that equation that because I'd studied all this and she was in an abuse loop, that I could help her more than anyone in her life, and that I could have more positive impact per hour on her than anyone else I knew of in the world. So that was the basis for getting into the relationship, which initially wasn't romantic. It was a supportive relationship. And when we got married, it was the same equation, only to my surprise, she was helping me more than any single person on the planet, which I hadn't expected. And so it felt, balanced, and thus a great marriage. But that was, the equation. And then that relationship is outside of the equation of the wound. Then work, of course, doing my work as a landscape designer and installer outside the equation of the wound. So, helping people, spending time in Thailand was outside the equation of the wound. Because I hadn't been abused in Thailand. I was abused in my house. And so these are ways to pull out of a nosedive. And the amount of impact that a faulty equation will have is determined by how much you're invested in it, how much you identify with the part that's invested, how much of you invest, the precariousness of your position to begin with. Like if you were on the edge of bankruptcy and you invested 10% of your money in something that went to zero, now you're bankrupt. But if you're stronger, so building up resiliency, I also formed a nonprofit to help be of community service. So that's, again, another identity. But, it felt life and death, each step of the way. And so this is what I'm highlighting is the fact that I am more and that you are more than any single event or identity in your life. By definition, the one who has the experience is bigger than the experience. Now, if you invest a ton of energy, hope, expectation, trust, and all that in a particular experience and it blows up in your face, you will be devastated because perhaps 50% of you has blown up. And you don't get that money back, you don't get that identity back, you don't get that trust back. It's destroyed by participating in an unwise equation, which is inevitable in a cult that doesn't examine itself enough to analyze equations. This would be one good use of algebra and mathematics. We just don't learn to use mathematics because it's so unromantic, isn't it? It's much more romantic to have your whole life fucked up by your therapist and isn't it lovely and call it love than it is to actually figure out all the, just how cruel it is to let your therapeutic client pay for an experience that has a 999% probability of destroying their lives. You have to be pretty dumb, pretty sociopathic, pretty narcissistic, and pretty cruel to do that with a straight face. Peter Sandhill is such a gentleman. And so that's, the thing that I'm playing with is that 2 plus 6 times 7, you got 8 times 7, that always equals 49. You don't get to play with that. What you get to decide to some degree is if 49 or if 49 is a bad number. If you do not want 49 at the end, if you don't want to be hit by your partner as the end, don't put much energy into that equation. And of course, in a culturally illiterate cult where we don't know what equation equals what and everyone giving advice and very few healthy statistics, some things people have never been asked once in their life. I have asked probably over 50 women, can you tell me what I would have to do in order for you to feel completely loved and supported in this relationship? Now, 100% of these women in an emotionally illiterate cult, in a relationally illiterate cult, have told me, no one has ever asked me that question in my entire life. And it is one of the most important questions anyone could possibly ask and answer if you want a good, loving relationship. Because if you don't know the answer to that, how the hell is your non-psychic partner going to know the answer to that? They're not. And they won't. And when it hurts, if you're too dumb to know that you're dumb, and that's our culture, I'm not talking any personal criticism here. If you're too dumb to know that you're dumb because you're in a cult that's too dumb to know that it's dumb, you are going to blame your partner. And this is the key thing in this mathematical formula. 2 plus 6 equals 8. It's not your partner's fault and it's not your fault if you want to get to another number. Meaning sexual abuse with a therapist equals horrendous pain. That's the way it is. If you don't want to have experience horrendous pain, don't have sex with your therapist. It's that, you don't go to Vegas with a 99.9% chance of losing money and then complain to that casino. It's not the casino and there's nothing wrong with your luck. Don't go to Vegas if you want to make money. That's the key thing, that I'm pointing out. On the other hand, you are always bigger than the experiences and the equations you participate in. And so if you don't know something, invest gently. Now, the best thing, of course, to do is to know a lot, become highly competent, study what our cult refuses to study, and invest heavily when you get strong signals that investing heavily will give a good dividend, a good return on investment. And do not invest at all when the odds are high that it's going to be terrible. Do not invest a penny in a sexual abuse relationship with your therapist. Invest hundreds of thousands of dollars, if you can afford it, in a terrific marriage. Set it up so that it can win. That is the mathematics, and this is what probability fields reveal and actual statistics reveal. Alcohol is a terrible drug, for example. You're much better off smoking pot than drinking a lot. Those are the statistics. So, know the odds. And similarly, you have a 300 times higher probability of being injured in a horseback accident than you do smoking pot. So know your statistics. Don't just encourage your children to go horseback riding and tell them not to smoke pot when there's a 300 times higher likelihood that they'll get in an accident if they're horseback riding. If you want them to stay safe, be sane. Tell a story that matches the data. Your kids will believe you, and you'll get the results that you want. So the equation, it's not about the person for the most part. Now, it's about the person because everyone has different beliefs and attitudes and stuff like that. For example, if my therapist hadn't been so grandiose and hadn't pushed for an overdose, probably wouldn't have happened at all. But it's the combination of grandiosity and, lust and stupidity and betrayal that leads to these kinds of things. And then, look at the part that is always bigger than the event. Trauma is a phenomenon of flooding, and I want you to look at this. So you're looking at this and this and me and this. It's very comfortable. Watch what happens as flooding occurs. If this is your world, how are you going to recover from this? You're going to be terrified. Goes blank. You can't see. Your body says, I can't make head or tail of this. That's what happens when you're flooded in a destructive equation. So to get perspective, you need 3 or 4 friendships, preferably. You need this. You need this. You need you need to develop and cultivate the parts that are outside the equation. Now, in a shadow-averse abuse cult, if you find yourself with the misfortune of being highly traumatized, then you're in a sociopathic environment. When you communicate that, everyone avoids you. So now you can't diversify and build an identity. That's why I married a woman overseas, not a sociopathic. And so, that's just, part of the difficult situation. And I think, there's a lot more that can be explored this, but just to recap, you have the probability field is one of the most important things. You're always bigger than any given experience or any given identity or any given relationship. But the more you're fully invested in one thing, the more important it is to get the equation right. And confidence comes from successful, repeated experience. It's ridiculous to say, boost yourself up to jump off a cliff. I'm confident. You have no repeated successful experience of flying, so having a positive attitude is suicide, and you will die, so don't do that. Gain confidence by literature. John Gottman actually does research on successful relationships and trust and all that. Judith Herman, Trauma and Recovery. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. Alice Miller, Drama of the Gifted Child, or When the Body Never Lies. These books give data sets that are incredibly useful for this terrain. So you are more than the equation, but if you love yourself, pick equations that equal numbers that you like. 2 + 6, whether it's with a handsome guy or an ugly guy, still equals 8. Understanding where you want to go and what behaviors of all the possibility fields, most of which are outside cult norms, which is mean you have to decide, do you want to be normal or do you want to be happy? Happy people are not normal in this cult and in most cults. Cults are not designed to make you happy. They're designed to create a level of conformity that makes other people comfortable and to protect you from the unknown. in which lies all new discovery. All new discovery, positive and negative, lies in the unknown. Dogmatic cults protect you from that. Fanaticism protects you from that. So freedom to give the meaning to your equation, to play within the variables of the equation, to learn from the equation, how much to invest in a given equation, for what purpose, freedom. But probability fields, to a large extent, are probability fields. You can take a bit of arsenic for an experience of being poisoned, or because you're having it injected by someone who wants to kill you. You can have your freedom and stuff around that, but there's never been a time in history when drinking a bunch of arsenic made you feel better. So pay attention to the statistical knowledge more than the positive attitude. You can enjoy yourself more if you're dying of arsenic poisoning. Why not? But don't pretend that it's as good as a glass of organic orange juice if you have choice. Take care.